Welcome to the German Nagoya Protocol Hub's podcast series, Nagoya Bites. Nagoya Bites is all about helping researchers in the academic sector in Germany with understanding their obligations arising from the implementation of the Nagoya Protocol. My name is Elizabeth Karger, or you can call me Liz. I'm the manager of the German Nagoya Protocol Hub, or the GMP Hub for short, and I'm your host today. I'm delighted that you've tuned in. If you find this podcast useful, or you'd like to suggest a topic for a future podcast, don't forget to let us know via the contact form on the GNP Hub website. You can find the link in the show notes. Our topic today is one that has been raising a lot of interest in the academic research community in Germany over the past few months. User checks. User checks in the academic sector started back in September 2020. That means this is relatively new and unfamiliar territory for a lot of actors in the research community. And the GNP Hub has been contacted about this by several institutions. There are a lot of questions. For example, about why institutions were selected for checks, the process, what's expected from the competent authority, among other things. Our podcast today is intended to clear up some of these questions and hopefully help those institutions being checked or those that will be checked in future with understanding the process. So for this purpose, I'm joined today by Mr. Thomas Greiber. Thomas is the head of the Nagoya Protocol Unit of the competent authority in Germany. That's the Federal Agency for Nature Conservation, or Bundesamt für Naturschutz in German. We just refer to it as the BFN. I should also mention at this point that the BFN funds the German Nagoya Protocol Hub project with funds from the Federal Ministry for Nature Conservation, Environment and Nuclear Safety. So, Thomas, welcome.
Thanks, Liz. It's a pleasure to be with you today, and thank you for inviting me to this first podcast session.
As I said before, we've had a lot of questions so far, so I think it's probably a good place to start with the absolute basics. Let's just assume that the listeners today are not really sure about the role of the competent authority, what the checks are, and what the purpose is. Perhaps we can start with those three questions. Can you tell us something about that?
Sure. As you mentioned before, the BFN is the competent authority for the implementation of the Nagoya Protocol and the respective EU regulation in Germany. And in this role, we are, amongst other things, responsible for user checks. Our first checks started in the year 2018. We first focused on different industry sectors, but then in September 2020, we also started with our checks in the academic sector.
And so what are exactly the purpose of these checks? What are you actually trying to do?
The purpose is quite simple. We aim to ensure that research in Germany is compliant with EU regulation and its so-called due diligence obligations. And this due diligence system, which has been established by the EU regulation, basically requires that users, which can be individual researchers, but also their research institutions, have to make sure that they comply with so-called ABS, access and benefit sharing regulations of the country where the genetic resources originally come from. That is to say, if a country of origin requires a permit to be obtained and a benefit sharing agreement to be established, before the material is researched, then our researchers need to get these documents before they start with their research. They need to keep the documents for 20 years, and they also need to share these documents with other research colleagues who might use the same material in the future.
So coming back to this question of the checks, how does the BFN actually know who to check? I mean, there are a lot of institutions out there. You said it can also be the individuals. I mean, there are thousands of researchers across Germany. How do you actually know who falls under the scope of the EU regulation and who should be checked?
Yeah, well, the EU regulation requires that we develop so-called control plans, which need to be updated regularly. And in 2018, so before we started with our first compliance checks, we developed such a first control plan. And later this year, we hope to develop a new control plan, so an updated one. And there are basically two ways a check can be triggered, either by a risk analysis, in which we do some research to identify institutions and possible users of genetic resource. Um, or our checks can be also triggered by substantiated concerns that an infringement of the EU law has occurred. In the end, risk-based user checks may also lead to, again, substantiated concerns of non-compliance at other institutions. And like this, actually, our compliance checks develop, and institutions or individual researchers are identified to be checked.
Can you tell me how many institutions were actually checked or have been checked so far in the academic sector?
In line with our control plan, we started with 10 academic research institutions in 2020 as part of our risk-based controls. But I should also mention that we had already started one compliance check with an academic research institution in 2019 based on substantiated concerns.
And at the beginning of the podcast, I mentioned that the GNP Hub has actually received a number of questions. And so for a lot of institutions, actually this planned check came as a little bit of a surprise to them, and they weren't really sure like how they were selected, you know, and the sort of feeling of like, oh, why me? Yeah. So this is something that these institutions are curious about. So you mentioned this already a little bit of doing like a risk analysis. Could you say a little bit more about how the institutions were selected?
In this first round, the selection process was relatively straightforward. So far, we have a long list with institutions from relevant industry sectors, but also academic research institutions. And for our first checks in the academic sector, we then selected 20 institutions from this list on a random basis. Then we looked very closely at each one of them to understand what the institution is doing concretely and whether we have any indication that this institution and the research that is being undertaken might fall within the scope of the EU regulation. And out of these 20, we selected on a random basis. We then filtered 10 institutions where we had the most relevant information, which might sound quite simplistic, but actually there's a lot of background research that we had to undertake or that we undertook for this selection process, looking at websites, publications, patent databases, etc. And all this research, background research, was done before we actually started with the compliance check then.
So, in other words, the BFN had done its homework before people received notification that a check was being done.
Yes.
So what happens in a check? What's the process? Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So far we always contacted the head of the institution via regular mail with a letter explaining that a compliance check is being conducted. In this letter, we also explain the legal basis. We have a little attachment which summarizes the legal instruments and provides further information on that. And then we attach a questionnaire which has to be filled out and sent back to us. And this questionnaire includes a number of questions regarding the level of awareness about the EU regulation and the Nagoya Protocol and ABS in general, the preparedness of the researchers to fulfill their due diligence obligations, and also activities that might be in scope of the EU regulation. So after the questionnaire is filled in and signed and returned to us, we may have some more specific questions in order to clarify the information we received or to confirm the same understanding. Here, our initial background research helps us, of course, a lot. And we also might challenge the statements or information that was provided to us. For example, if there's a misunderstanding on the side of the researcher about the scope of the EU regulation, then we try to clarify that. So the correspondence may go back and forth several times between the BFN and the relevant institution and researcher, depending on the comprehensiveness and clarity of information provided by the institution that is checked. And last but not least, depending on the information provided and how the correspondence develops, we then may also conduct an on-site inspection.
And what happens if a researcher receives the questionnaire and just thinks, oh, I'm not going to fill that out? What are the rules? Are the researchers and institutions required to fill out the questionnaire?
Yeah, no doubt about it, about this. There's a clear legal obligation under the EU and German law to support our user checks. So institutions are required to answer to our questions, to provide us information, to hand out copies of documents if we demand, but also to give us access to their premises. So a generous tip is the more transparent the institutions are and the better their ABS documentation system is, the quicker a compliance check can be finalized.
Sometimes, the institutions have to provide quite a lot of information. There are a lot of researchers at the institute. There's a lot of research being done. They're working with a lot of different types of material from different sources. So it can be quite a lot of information to kind of bring together and bundle and provide to the BFN. Do you have any kind of template that can be provided or used by researchers so that they can present this information to you?
No, unfortunately not. All I can say is there are different types of questions with predefined answers where you can take a box and then you have also some space to leave comments. And in practice, we see that there is sometimes a considerable amount of extra information that needs to be provided, which then is attached or provided to us in digital form. Or I mean, we are quite flexible there. But there's no standard format for how to provide us with the information or how to make the comments also, if you include any comments in the questionnaire. What helps in practice is, as I said before, first of all, transparency. This is key. And second, reading the EU guidance document on the EU regulation is also helpful because this facilitates the understanding and, a certain terminology has been used in the EU guidance document to describe certain research activities, and if the same terminology and language is being used also in the questionnaire, then this helps also us to better understand the other side.
So how is this when people are filling out this form? It asks about genetic resources. We know that genetic resources, this has a particular definition that some material falls within the scope of the EU regulation, that some material does not. So my next question is, does the BFN require a list of all samples of biological material that are being used at an institution for research purposes, even if they don't fall within the scope of the regulation? For example, because the material was originally obtained before 2014, or perhaps the provider country doesn't have any ABS laws in place?
Yeah, so in our recent questionnaire, the one we now used in this first cycle, we basically had three questions on this topic. The first question was where we generally asked about genetic resources which were obtained after the 12th of October 2014, which is this cut-off date or the date when the Nagoya Protocol and the EU regulation entered into force. And we asked whether these genetic resources were obtained under a standard material transfer agreement, as it is being used in the context of the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture, because that has also other legal implications. And then after that question, we asked whether such resources had been utilized in the sense of the EU regulation. Right, and if that the answer was no, then we asked for a further explanation in this open field. And there I come back again to what I said before about the terminology that is being used in the EU guidance document, which helps us also to understand what the other side is doing. And last but not least, we also asked if generic resources which had been utilized, so based on the previous answer, whether such general resources utilized came from a Nagoya Protocol party, because this is another requirement for the scope of the EU regulation. But we did not expect everyone to know all Nagoya Protocol parties by heart. So to facilitate the answer, we also gave the option to list all countries, and then we can see for ourselves which are relevant or not.
So, if someone's doing pure taxonomic research and this is not utilization, they're not utilizing genetic resources in the sense of the regulation, do they still need to fill out the survey?
Yes, for sure. Not because we are broadening the scope of the EU regulation that is defined as it is, but we often see that there is quite some misunderstanding concerning, for example, the definition of utilization, or who's a Nagoya Protocol party or not, and who has ABS rules or not. So I mentioned before, the more transparent, the easier and faster to check, because we might have some more information about ABS rules applying in certain countries than let's say the broader research community, and also this understanding what is utilization and what not.
It seems like the questions people have are not always, yeah, directly related to the user check itself or the process. There are questions about, yeah, the application of the EU regulation, utilization. As you said, this is not always clear to people. Am I in scope or not? What should people do in this situation if they have these kinds of questions? What do you recommend?
People can always contact us by email or phone. In the past, we also met with researchers from different institutions to clarify their questions, or we gave presentations at the institutions to explain the whole mystery of the Nagoya Protocol. And another option is, of course, to get in touch with you, Liz, the hub, or other colleagues from the research sector who are a little bit more familiar with this topic. And there's definitely enough information out there nowadays. There are websites, not only the BFN website or the hub website. There are also other websites, let alone the ABS Clearinghouse. There are brochures by different institutions, including also BFN. Information events, trainings are offered, etc., to get informed. So there are plenty of options to get answers to your question. It's just that you have to make an effort.
So let's go back to the process of the user checks. So one question I received was about whether or not institutions should have a central contact person who takes care of the user checks, or whether it's better if all of the individual researchers take care of the response and answer the questionnaire and send this back to the BFN themselves. Do you have a particular view on that? Is there a best way to go about this at an institutional level?
Um, Difficult to say. I mean, there's no one size fits all here, and simply because we see that institutions are organized very differently, which again makes it difficult then to come up with a standard recommendation, so to say. Of course, Nagoya Protocol compliance or liaison officer can be a great asset, but we are also aware of different financial means at different institutions. So it is not a must to have a Nagoya Protocol contact person or to centralize everything or what have you. I mean, in our controls, we've seen both responses through a channel, so to say, where one person collected all the answers and then submitted it in as a package, so to say. But in other institutions, it was handled differently. That then different research units, so to say, replied to us. However, it's also clear that users and let me make this very clear that a user in the sense of the EU regulation is not only the individual researcher, but it is also the legal person behind, meaning the institution that hosts the researcher. So the university, for example, cannot simply delegate the issue to the individual researchers, and that's it. In order to act diligently, as the EU regulation requires, the university, the institution, has to organize itself in a way that institutional structures, processes, and responsibilities related to the Nagoya Protocol are clear and functioning to support compliance. For example, it also has to take measures to ensure Nagoya Protocol awareness of the university staff.
So there's work to be done at an institutional level. I know that a couple of institutions already have guidelines or are working on them. Do you think it's helpful for institutions to have guidelines in general, but also for dealing with user checks to identify who's responsible and the process, etc., from an institutional perspective?
Yeah, yes. I mean, as I said, there is no one size fits all. There are different ways to approach it. You mentioned a compliance officer, contact person to centralize things in the administration or at a different divisional level through the research coordinators or whatever. Every institution has to look at its own setup, so to say. But the DFG, for example, the German Research Foundation, has an ABS working group, which is currently trying to develop some recommendations for institutions at the institutional level, which hopefully will be published later this year. And I have high hopes that this document, once it's finished, will provide some good guidance also for the institutions.
I think initiatives like this are really important. I think many institutions across Germany really need tools like this. They're extremely helpful, and it means that not every single institution has to reinvent the wheel and start from scratch. So I think everyone can look forward to that, and of course, we'll keep the research community updated and let them know when it's available on our website. Yeah, so let's come back to the checks again. At a couple of institutions that I spoke to, the letter from the BFN just landed on somebody's desk. This person was told to deal with it, although they had no previous experience with the Nagoya Protocol or the EU regulation, and they were not really sure how to go about the process. What do you say about situations like this?
Well, that is exactly the problem. The institution itself is sitting in the same boat. So simply delegating the issue to the next level or to one individual who has to deal with it won't really help, but rather increases the risk of non-compliance, so to say.
So if you detect non-compliance through one of the checks, what happens then?
Yeah, there are different consequences. As an immediate reaction, if we identify a situation of non-compliance, the further use of the material has to stop, and the research results cannot be used anymore. And that means ongoing research projects, for example, will be halted, and also the publication of research results will be prohibited. Of course, researchers and their institutions can try to rectify the situation of non-compliance. And if they succeed and get the necessary Nagoya Protocol documents that they have to have from the country of origin, the prohibition of further using the material and of publishing research results, that prohibition can be lifted. However, it is not possible if it's not possible to get the Nagoya Protocol documents retroactively, which is always a possibility, the prohibition stands, and the material and also the research results can be confiscated. So it's important to note in this context that there are a number of countries who have taken the deliberate decision not to issue Nagoya Protocol documents retroactively. And regardless of these orders and remedial actions, non-compliance can also be sanctioned by a regulatory fine up to 50,000 euro under the German Implementing Act.
So it sounds like there are really consequences both for the individual researcher who perhaps has to stop their research and maybe can't continue again in future if they can't rectify the situation, but also for the institution in terms of these potentially quite large regulatory fines.
Right. Both the individual researcher and the institute can be responsible. It always depends on the situation and, for example, what the institute has done to meet its due diligence obligations. Have they done nothing and simply delegated the issue to the lower level, or have they taken also compliance measures in, for example, developing policies and clarifying responsibilities, as I mentioned before? Have they undertaken trainings and awareness raising and so on and so forth?
So, in other words, it really needs to be understood as a joint responsibility by the researchers and the institutions as well, and there can be consequences for either or both.
Totally.
Okay. So we heard before that the checks started back in 2020, and a number of institutions have been checked. Obviously, you can't share any information with us about specific cases or the institutions involved, but I wanted to ask you whether or not there are any sort of lessons learned from this first round of user checks.
In our limited number of compliance checks, as I said, we started in 2018, and so from the academic sector, we have only checked 10 institutions based on our risk analysis. But with this limited number, we've already seen quite a variety of situations. We have seen institutions and researchers who were clearly well informed and organized also, but we've also seen the contrary, those still being completely unaware and not really organized. So as take-home messages, I can only summarize or repeat again what has been said before. First of all, both the individual researcher and the institution hosting the researcher are sitting in the same boat. Simple delegation won't do the trick, and ignoring the issue won't do the trick either. Secondly, there's already a lot of information and support out there. People do not have to start from scratch. Networks like the Hub network are already existing and further ones are developing, so make use of these opportunities. Thirdly, transparency and cooperation with us, with the BFN, is what is really needed, and it helps all of us to deal with the situation in an efficient and effective manner. And last but not least, our plea is to take the issue serious. You might not like the Nagoya Protocol and the issue of access and benefit sharing, but it is a reality in the countries where the genetic resources originate, but also in the countries where they are used, like Germany, like other EU member states, and so on. So rather go and try to get help than risking non-compliance leading to potential reputational and even financial damage. So that's our recommendation.
I think this is an important point too. This issue of reputational damage. I mean, this is not something that comes from the BFN. This comes from the non-compliance itself. It has nothing to do with the regulatory system, but is still an important consequence for the individual, but also a research institution.
Absolutely. And we've seen cases where bad publicity has created or was created, and which I think is not for the benefit of anyone. Also, in view of future research you might want to undertake in the same country again, or in neighboring countries, or the same region, you know, such information spreads.
So that means take compliance seriously.
Yes.
As you said, it's a reality, so it has to be dealt with, whether people like it or not. All right. Well, Thomas, that was really helpful. It was very informative. I hope our listeners enjoyed it in some way or another. And hopefully it also cleared up some of their questions, or perhaps some of the confusion about the process and the purpose of user checks. So thank you very much for your time today. It was great.
Well, thank you, Liz, once more for the invitation, and it was a pleasure to join you for this first podcast. And I hope things are a bit clearer now for the audience. And as I said before, if there are open questions, you know, contact Liz or contact us. We are happy to help you out.
And with that, we've already reached the end of this first episode of Nagoya Bites. So thank you to everyone who tuned in and listened. If you have any questions, you can, of course, reach out to us, as Thomas said, and reach out to the BFN. And don't forget that you can find lots of other very useful information about user checks and other issues related to the Nagoya Protocol and compliance issues on the GNP Hub website. So we've reached the end of today's episode, and it's time to say goodbye. Thank you for tuning in to Nagoya Bites. Don't forget to check out the GNP Hub website for lots of other useful information about Nagoya Protocol compliance. And of course, if you still have questions, you can reach out to us through the contact form. What did you think of our podcast? If you have any feedback for us, you can also let us know through the contact form. And if you have suggestions for future topics, you can leave those there as well. For regular updates on the GNP Hub, you can follow us on Twitter, or you can check out the news section of the website. Keep an eye out for upcoming episodes of Nagoya Bites. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.